I'll see you all tomorrow.
Yeah, we're going to for that.
Yeah. It's going to be good.
But I want to make sure Amy took care of you. Amy took care of you. Amy buying you lunch tomorrow. Yeah, we know. Thank you. Great job.
Great. Well, take care.
Awesome.
Yeah, I did. I did. Well, I did. And I'm like, okay, I saw your flyer. Come on.
Can I ask everybody to take their seats so we can begin in a few minutes? We'll start in a minute or two. So if you can take your seats, that would be great. Good morning, everybody. We'll try to get started and keep us somewhat on schedule. My name is Peter Letsu, and I'm the Dean of the University of Memphis Cecil C. Humphreys School of Law. And on behalf of the School of Law and our wonderful partner, the National Civil Rights Museum, it's my privilege and honor to welcome you to our MLK50 Symposium, Where Do We Go From Here? The theme of our symposium is based on Dr. King's fourth and final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Published in 1967, Dr. King's book challenges us to consider how we can most effectively advance the cause of civil rights and social justice. To examine the theme identified in Dr. King's book, and to commemorate Dr. King and his work at this 50th anniversary of his passing, we've assembled a truly outstanding group of nationally and internationally recognized thought leaders. And we've asked them to share with us their perspectives on the state of civil and human rights issues and racial and economic equity 50 years after the death of Dr. King. Today's program will consist of 4 moderated panels, each with 4 panelists drawn from academia, government, and the legal profession, and each moderated by one of our School of Law's distinguished professors. Each panel will examine a special aspect of Dr. King's legal legacy, and each panelist will prepare an essay which will be published later this year by the University of Memphis Law Review. This issue will provide a lasting written record of the symposium. It will chronicle the progress over the last 50 years and provide a blueprint for the future. Extraordinary events like this one require extraordinary support of all kinds. So I'd be remiss if I didn't begin today's program by offering my deepest personal thanks to the many people and institutions who've contributed their talents and resources to this symposium. The sponsors for the first day of our symposium are listed on page 15 of our program. And I realize the list is a long one, but I also think it's important to acknowledge and thank all of our sponsors individually for the opportunity they've given us to mark this historic occasion so magnificently. So I'd appreciate it if you'd hold your applause to the end while I recognize our sponsors. The Hyde Family Foundation, FedEx, First Tennessee Foundation, the Remember George A. Riley Fund, Catherine and Thurston Roach, J.C. Penney, the Kresge Foundation, International Paper, AutoZone, Bassbury and Sims, Baker, Donaldson, Bierman, Caldwell, and Berkowitz, Butler Snow, Birch, Porter, and Johnson, Thomas Campbell, Kathy and J.W. Gibson, SunTrust, the Wharton Charitable Foundation, the Wharton Law Firm, and the A.C. Wharton Group, Baptist Memorial Healthcare, Harris, Shelton, Hanover, and Walsh, Jackson Lewis, the Lander Smith College, Service Master, Shea, Moskowitz, and McGee, the Spence Law Firm, St. Jude Legal Services, the University of Memphis College of Arts and Sciences, the University of Memphis College of Education, the University of Memphis Office of Development, and Wyatt Tarrant Combs. The length of this list demonstrates the exceptionally giving and supportive nature of the community of which we are part. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors for their support. I'd also like to thank 3 other groups for their outstanding contributions to this event. First, we have our panelists and moderators. They're truly an extraordinary group, and each will be introduced to you individually during the panel presentations. I have to say, I've been a legal educator for nearly 30 years now, and I can say without hesitation or qualification, this group of panelists is the most impressive I've ever seen under one roof. So you'll see our panelists and moderators later in the day, but again, I want to acknowledge them for doing all the hard work that goes into making this day such a success. Second, we have a special group of guests at our symposium, professors from across the country who have traveled to Memphis to take part in this event. In this week's historic commemoration, I refer to them as our travel scholars. I appreciate them coming out and joining with us in this program and also helping to make it a great success and taking their time to be here with us. Finally, we have the staff members from the University of Memphis, and the National Civil Rights Museum, who have worked tirelessly on this event, many of them for more than a year. Most of them are still working right now, so they're not in the room to be recognized, but I'd like to again recognize them and thank them and let them know how much I appreciate all they've done to make this day, to bring this day to reality and make it such a great success. I know I just said finally, but I actually have 2 other people I'd like to thank. Dr. David Rudd, the president of the University of Memphis, who has lent his extremely strong support to this program from its earliest days, and Terry Freeman, president of the National Civil Rights Museum, who's partnered with us in planning this 2-day symposium and who has done so much in her role as president of the National Civil Rights Museum to commemorate this 50th anniversary of Dr. King's passing. So I'd like to ask Dr. Rudd and then President Freeman to come up and say a few words before we begin our first panel.
On behalf of the University of Memphis, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium, an event bringing together scholars, thought leaders, policymakers, and practitioners to reflect on the life and enduring legacy of Dr. King. Today's symposium is the culmination of a year-long commemoration of Dr. King's tragic assassination in Memphis 50 years ago. We won't just reflect on Dr. King's legacy, but also ask critical questions. Where do we go from here? How do we address the ongoing challenges of inequality and social justice, not just in Memphis, but across the nation and the globe? The University of Memphis occupies a unique position in our community. We are not just the University of Memphis, but the University for Memphis. With more than 21,000 students and several thousand faculty and staff, we have a unique partnership with this city. We are deeply engaged in almost every aspect of daily life in Memphis. Given this relationship, the university is uniquely positioned to serve as the facilitator of critical conversations around the core issues that impact us as citizens in West Tennessee and the broader state. Today's program will address a complex array of issues related to criminal justice, voting rights, persistent poverty, and 21st century activism. Although we cannot promise solutions to these problems, we can promise engaged, informed, and passionate conversation and exploration, and a remarkable opportunity for learning and growth for each and every one of us. I'd like to join Peter in thanking our panelists and moderators, our sponsors, the many scholars who have traveled to be with us today, and the incredible members of the university and museum staff who have made this symposium possible. Programs like the one you're going to experience today don't just happen. They are the result of a community of efforts. and we are especially fortunate at the University of Memphis to be a part of such a remarkably supportive community. I'd also like to recognize and thank the National Civil Rights Museum, one of the nation's premier museums, under the direction of President Terry Freeman. She will speak with you in just a few minutes. We are proud to have such an outstanding institution as our neighbor, and we are especially proud to have the museum as a partner in this historic symposium. Finally, I want to thank our audience. I want to thank you for being here today. We are very grateful for your time, and I can promise you that it will be time well spent. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I am so pleased to have the opportunity to see this all come together. Dean, thank you so much. President Rudd, thank you as well. You know, it really is exciting to see this 50th anniversary culminate with this week's events. The National Civil Rights Museum has a 4-point mission: to chronicle the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, to examine today's civil and human rights issues, to provoke thoughtful debate, and to serve as a positive catalyst for social change. So under that mission, and under our theme of where do we go from here, the museum began planning these commemoration events actually about 2 years ago now. And we launched them on April 4th, 2017, and the university was right at our side all the way. Since that date, we have had events that targeted youth, the clergy, our business community, and concerned citizens under the banner of our chosen theme: where do we go from here? This 2-day symposium is one of the highlights of our commemorative events, and we are happy, as I said, to be presenting this with our co-host, the University of Memphis Cecil C. Humphreys School of Law. Our hope is that you will take from this symposium new ways of viewing the work accomplished and the work yet to be done. That you will see yourself in the role of participant, not simply bystander, and that you will be energized to help secure additional gains in the fight for freedom and justice. As we move through the events of this next few days, I hope you will keep these words from Dr. King close. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. Thank you so much, because I know you all are dedicated individuals.
Ask our first panel to come join us on the stage. Thank you, Dr. Rudd. Thank you, President Freeman. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first panel focusing on criminal justice. This panel will address policing in communities of color and contemporary penal policy, while grappling with complex questions of what policing and punishment should look like going forward. The panel moderator is Professor Demetria Frank. Professor Frank is an assistant professor of law at the University of Memphis School of Law, teaching courses in evidence, federal courts, and mass incarceration. Her scholarly research focuses on prisoner rights and bias in the criminal justice system. She's also director of Project MI, a collaborative that aims to transform the criminal justice system by connecting communities to lawmakers and developing local youth support programs. Professor Frank will provide fuller introductions for our criminal justice panelists, who include Roy Austin, partner at Harris, Wiltshire Grannis, and former Deputy Assistant to President Obama for the Office of Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity. Next to him, Professor Mark Osler, Professor and Robert and Marion Short Distinguished Chair in Law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, followed by Professor Frank. And then next to her left, Tracey Maclin, Professor of Law and Joseph Lipsitt Faculty Research Scholar at the Boston University School of Law. And finally, at my far left, Toussaint Losier, an Assistant Professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst College of Humanities and Fine Arts. So welcome to our moderator and to our panelists. And I turn the floor over to Professor Frank.
Thank you so much, Dean Litsu. Good morning. It's so exciting to be with all of you today, and I'm so excited about our panelists. I think Dean Litsu stole a little bit of my thunder with the introduction of our panelists, so I'm just going to get to it. As we reflect on King's legacy and the question that he asked in his last book, where do we go from here? Our goal with this panel is to figure out how far we've come in the area of criminal justice in the last 50 years, and also how far do we have to go to a fair justice system for all. So with that, I will begin. I'd like to start with some general questions that relate to Dr. King's work and his legacy. And my first question is to you, Dr. Losier. I was going to say that you are an assistant professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies. Do you think Dr. King's infamous demand that his children not be judged by the content of their character, does that have criminal justice implications in your view?
First of all, I wanted to wish you all good morning and thank you for the welcome. There's obviously some difference between University of Massachusetts and University of Memphis, but if you all wanted to, find a way to switch my position from one university to another, we could be open for some conversation. You all have been very hospitable here, so if we could keep that rolling, that would be great. I think, obviously, that's the quote from the I Have a Dream speech, and to be judged not by the color of your skin, by the content of your character. And I think that has, it has very profound criminal justice implications. I think one of the things that all of us here today, and I think it's very important that we sort of start off the sort of events of the next several days with the question of criminal justice, is because I think in many ways criminal justice oftentimes serves as sort of one of the key markers in society today of questions of racial inequality. Really, there are ways in which it can house kind of profound questions of racial discrimination and bias under the color of the law in some instances. And I think one of the things that we really need to wrestle with is that oftentimes those who find themselves subject to the law in criminal justice matters, it's not simply a question of not being judged by the content of one's character, but individuals have to deal with the way in which they can be judged, not just by the color of their skin, but by their zip code, where they live, what their educational background is, the degree to which they can afford representation, that these markers that have to do oftentimes with questions of race, but also oftentimes questions of class, one's access to wealth, are very much shape one's experience within the criminal justice system, and are pressing concerns that King raised, especially in where do we go from here, questions of poverty in particular, but really the ways in which we've failed to wrestle with them and confront them really are kind of stare us in the face when we look at the question of mass incarceration, the way in which we have the United States is the kind of not only the world's leader in incarceration with 2.3 million people behind bars, but is that has a profound disproportionate impact on African Americans in particular. And so one of the things that this panel, but all of us, I think, really have to wrestle with is the way in which that dream that King spoke to, in many ways, is not only unrealized, but has regressed in some ways from where he was when he proclaimed it.
Thank you so much. The intertwine of race and justice is extremely complicated, as we've seen over the last few years especially, but I'd like to ask what may be an overly simplistic question of our audience, if you all don't mind. And I would like to know, just so our panel has a sense of this optimism, how optimistic are we about a colorblind justice system? So by show of hands, can my audience let us know whether you believe a colorblind justice system is possible? Yes, if you would raise your hand, please. That optimistic, huh? So I want to pose the same question to you, Professor Osler. As Dean Letsue mentioned, you're the Robert and Marion Short Professor of Law at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. You've written extensively on clemency, sentencing, narcotics policy. How optimistic are you?
Not as optimistic as some of the people in the audience, I think. But one thing that frames this question, I think it's important to recognize, and it relates directly to Dr. King, and that is that there's a false narrative regarding Dr. King and regarding this question. It was summed up for me when I read Attorney General Sessions' speech on Martin Luther King Day from this year. And the false narrative is this.
I'm sorry, Mark, why did you read that?
We've had back and forth for a while. But the false narrative is this, that there was racism in the United States, and it was explicit. There was segregation, there was job discrimination, there was laws on the books that distinguished black from white. And then Dr. King came along, and he solved the problems. And now we're done. In fact, he refers in that speech to, now it's a reality, the dream. And that's not true. We only need to look at the data that's available about racial discrepancies in criminal justice. And here's the thing, is that even though we have, on the face of it in the law, racial neutrality, there's bias in our country, in the society. And as long as there's bias in the society, there's going to be bias in criminal law. And that's because there's these big pools of discretion where people make decisions in a hidden place. Police officers who make arrests and react to citizens, prosecutors who make charging decisions. And there's a poison in those waters, and it is that bias. This is going to be a very long-range project if we're going to address bias in the greater society. And it's not until we solve that problem that, as long as we have those big pools of discretion, we're going to have that same problem within criminal justice.
Thank you. Attorney Roy Austin, you're currently the partner and trial attorney with law firm of Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis, and you were previously an honors trial attorney with the criminal section of Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. What do you believe people should know about the inequities of the criminal justice system and how that might impact inequities generally?
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this. I think the thing I want people to know, and it's really, I would just add on to what Mark said, but I would start it a little bit earlier. I mean, it starts with our kids. It starts with school discipline. It starts with 1 million kids being suspended or expelled every year. And once you take that kid out of school in some way, or you push that kid behind in school in some way, it is unbelievable that we are then surprised that that kid then struggles later in life. And then we look at that discipline, and when I was at the Department of Justice, we did a review of the discipline that was happening here with respect to the juvenile courts in Memphis and Shelby County. We looked at what was happening in Meridian, Mississippi, and we saw that at the very beginning, black young people were being treated differently than white young people at every single step of the juvenile justice system. They were being treated differently with respect to schools and everything else. And so when we start there, and we look at, you start there, you move to, and this is just talking about the criminal justice system. It was already mentioned, the educational system, the housing system, everything else, but then you go to what the interactions between black youth and police, between black men and police. And then you go to the interactions between African Americans and courts. What happens with prosecutors? What happens when you go to jail? What happens when you come out of jail? At every single step of the criminal justice system, blacks are treated worse. And then this is even if you control for what type of crime was committed, how old they were, whether they had a father in the household. You take all of those things and you find that blacks are being treated worse than whites. And so, when you ask the question of, whether I'm optimistic, I was optimistic under a certain president. My optimism is gone to hell right now. Because I'm looking at everything that we worked so hard on, and you're going to hear from Pam Carlin later, who I work with in the Civil Rights Division. Everything we worked so hard to start moving forward is being turned backward.
Thank you. And then finally, please welcome Professor Tracey Maclin. He is the Joseph Lipsitt Faculty Research Scholar at Boston University, is that right?
Yes.
And he has written extensively on the Fourth and Fifth Amendment and search and seizure law. So I'd like to ask Professor Maclin, what are some of the legal issues that systemically foster the inequities that we're all talking about?
I think I want to highlight two things that have already been said in terms of the legal issues. One is the point about discretion, which two of our panelists have already met. I grew up in the reading and looking at the pictures in Ebony magazine, and in the 60s and the early 70s, you thought, well, it's racist police officers, it's racist judges, it's racist prosecutors, racist governors in some parts of the country. And today, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem, as Roy just mentioned, is the discretion that many law enforcement officials, whether it be a police officer or a prosecutor or later a judge, just the discretion they have, and also the unconscious racism, if you want to call it that, that infects the various systems. When I say the various systems, for example, racial profiling. Police officers, if you talk to them, they won't say, well, I'm out to get black folks, I'm out to get Hispanic folks. They have in their heads, however, a frame of what a criminal is, what a drug dealer is, and that, in part, affects what they do. Studies have shown the same thing with respect to judges. And so Roy's point and Toussaint's point about discretion and what scholars like to call unconscious bias, I think those two things are real problems with the system, and you can't root out discretion. I mean, police officers have to have discretion. Prosecutors have to have discretion. We wouldn't want judges just making decisions just based on some guideline. But that discretion and the unconscious bias, those are real, I think, two of the roots of the problem.
Thank you so much. Since you raised the issue of unconscious bias and implicit bias, Dr. Losier, can you tell us a little bit more about the history of blacks in criminality in the United States and how that may contribute to the biases that we see that play out in these discretion areas in our justice system today?
Sure. So my background is I'm a historian by training. So the lawyers hopefully don't hold that against me, right? And one of the things that I think I think one of the things that historians have done a wonderful job of is demonstrating how much how it's sort of kind of woven into the fabric of history in this country, these questions of bias have been. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who currently teaches at Harvard University, has written a wonderful book on really the legacy of bias within both kind of questions of scientific racism, but also really questions of criminal law in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century, and really the sort of development of kind of modern America, and the ways in which questions of perceived almost kind of innate criminality as regards to African American migrants to the urban north really distinguish their treatment from those of European immigrants and sort of in the juvenile justice system and in the sort of early penal system, that these questions of trying to even use some of the very kind of statistics that are sort of the nuts and bolts of how we think about questions of racial disparity within the criminal justice system, that oftentimes the way in which statistical analysis was being done was being crafted in such a way as to draw on perceptions of a kind of innate criminality of African Americans, and how in many ways this built upon the sort of post-Civil War, almost kind of early prison had, particularly in the South, regarding the increased incarceration of formerly enslaved, particularly African American men, through the convict lease system, and how the sort of national implications of a system that oftentimes bore particularly hard on African Americans, leased them out to lease those who had been tried and convicted out to private companies to be held under their care and kind of heavily exploited, while their white counterparts were held within oftentimes some of the few prisons that existed in the South at that time. Right, the system of convict lease that scholars have increasingly shed light on really had national implications because it shaped the way in which scholars all across the country began to think about the interconnection between questions of race and crime. And this is something that in many ways kind of we stand in the shadows of to some degree, and even though kind of we're sort of past the horrors of the convict lease system and the the chain gang system in many ways, the ideas about how we think about questions of race as it relates to crime are still very much with us in some ways today.
On that note, Professor Osler, can you talk about some specific criminal justice bias issues that we see in prosecutors, judges, juries, just kind of in the system and even in law enforcement?
Yeah, it's very real and it's measurable. And most recently, well, not most recently, but prominently probably, the Rahavi and Starr study found a 13% black premium, as they called it, in sentencing disparities. And that's on top of all the other exercises of discretion that come before it. And there's a cost in lives and treasure to that. That just in the federal system, if we didn't have that black premium, there'd be 8 to 11,000 fewer people in federal prison. And we would save $230 million to $320 million a year simply by closing that gap that even controlling for all the things that you talked about, Roy, exists. And so we know that it is there. Now, other places that we see it, bail. That every study that's been done finds racial disparities in people having bail assessed against them, being unable to make bail, and that means that people are locked up who should not be, and that is a consistent and constant problem. Now let's imagine that things have gotten better, that even if from 1980 to 2015, bias amongst prosecutors, officers, judges had been cut in half. We would still have more victims of bias today because the whole system got bigger. Let's say it got cut in half, that for every 100 that you had in 1980, now it's 50. Well, it would be 50 if the system was the same size. Instead, we've got 200 because of the way that the system has grown. And that's why it's so important to take on not only bias, but shrinking that system as well.
So does anyone want to comment on the growing of that system, how we kind of got here?
Well, I just want to say on Mark's point, in yesterday's New York Times, this is Monday, Sunday's New York Times, there was a great article on bail and the amount of money that bail bond agents receive, I would urge you to look at that article because, of course, the impact, none of that, of course, is race-based, but the impact on African Americans, particularly poor African Americans, is quite significant. So yesterday's New York Times had a great article on that.
And I'll just add, I mean, this is something that we tried to address in the prior administration, and not too long ago, our good friend General Sessions revoked the effort that we made there, where we basically looked at the system and we saw quite simply that it was bail, it was fines, it was fees. We had our Council of Economic Advisors do an entire report on the problem and how it was affecting people. And it has basically created a system where the poor go to jail, the poor stay in jail, the poor lose their jobs, and the wealthy and the well-off are able to actually get around all of those things by bail. And then let's not talk about just the money that the bail bondsmen get, but let's talk about the money that the bail bondsmen give. So they give money to politicians to keep this system in place. It's the same thing that we're seeing with respect to the reversal on private prisons. Again, we've tried to move toward getting rid of private prisons. I mean, why should someone be earning money on the life of another human being, which is exactly what our private prisons do? But of course, one of the very first rules that the current administration revoked was the plan to remove private prisons. Well, guess who's giving a bunch of money to those politicians? Well, the private prisons are. And then just one final thing on talking about the growth of the system. I was looking to see, you know, did King actually address now we re-empower the officers. So what has this led to? Well, you would think that, you know, because this current administration is so data-based and evidence-driven, in fact driven, that they would in fact have evidence and data to back this up. Well, the evidence and facts that back this up are that more officers this last 3 months have died in the line of duty, and more civilians have been killed by officers than in the previous years. Well, this is insane. And it's stupid, and let me be very technical, it's dumb. But that is where we are. And I'm the practicing lawyer of this panel as opposed to the academic, so I can say these things more easily. So I don't know that we have a solution right now, because really what it is when that officer has that gun and that officer's fearful of that young black man that is at the other end of that for breaking a window, for speeding, for a broken headlight, for whatever stupidness they decide to be all hyped up about, the person on the other end of that gun is going to lose time and again.
Professor Maclin, can you talk about the phenomenon known as death by traffic stop?
Okay. I want to say, though, it's not, you ask, how can we get justice? It's complicated. First of all, you've got the Supreme Court of the United States in a 9-0 decision. Many in the audience may know about a case called Wren versus the United States. And in Wren, the Supreme Court said it's okay to pull over a vehicle so long as you have probable cause or reasonable suspicion that a traffic offense or some crime has been committed. Now, what was unspoken in Wren was that Michael Wren and his co-defendant, young man named Brown, whose first name escapes me right now. They were two African-American men in a so-called high crime area in the District of Columbia. The officers pulled those two over, not because they were interested in enforcing the traffic law, but because they thought they were drug couriers. And in fact, those officers, they were plainclothes police officers, and they were not allowed to make traffic stops unless there was an emergency. Now, the Supreme Court, 9-0, Thurgood Marshall was gone at that point, but 9-0, the Supreme Court said that's constitutional, even if the decision to pull these individuals over was motivated by some pretextual reason. Now, what you have with respect to traffic stops and what Roy was referring to, it's not about racist police officers. It's not about racist police departments. It's about police officers thinking that certain types of individuals fit their understanding of what it is to have a gun, or who has guns, who has drugs. And that's what's driving these decisions. So you have the problem of the Supreme Court of the United States, again, 9-0, saying this is okay under the Fourth Amendment. And then you have police officers who have been trained in part by the federal government during the 1990s. So it wasn't necessarily the Trump administration, but during the 90s and President Clinton's administration, you had the federal government, in particular DEA, training officers on how to use traffic stops to identify so-called drug couriers. Now, what happened in most of these situations were innocent people were stopped, and there were no guns, there were no drugs found. So when I say it's complicated, there's a lot to it, and just saying, well, we don't want police officers shooting people is not enough, because police departments and individual officers are trained and frankly believe that traffic stops are an effective way to reduce crime.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the statistics, I mean, forget about my thoughts. The statistics show that it doesn't reduce crime. In fact, again, most of the people stopped are innocent. The problem is the judges and frankly the prosecutors, they never hear about those individuals, because people who have been stopped, and many of us in the room I'm sure have been, who have been stopped, they just want to get as far away from that experience as possible. What you hear about on the local news, of course, are the rare cases where a police officer pulls somebody over for a broken tail light, as Roy mentioned, or failing to signal, and then after a fishing expedition has been started, they find drugs or they find guns. Those are the cases that the public hears about. They don't hear about the 9 other cases in which no guns, no drugs were found, and the person is just happy to go, and the police officer is on to the next case. So it doesn't work in terms of the statistics.
Anybody else want to comment on that? I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. Whether you were alive during the civil rights movement or not, I think most of us can think about images from the civil rights movement of officers being quite brutal with citizens who were standing up for their rights. And some would say that brutality has not exactly ended. It has just become more covert and insidious. And so I'd like anyone on the panel to, I invite all of you to comment on police and community relations and where we are with that.
Absolutely. I want to jump in and just sort of tie into my last point, and this has to do with Memphis. In 1985, the Supreme Court decided a case called Tennessee versus Garner. Garner was a young man who was 15 years old, who had burglarized a home and had left the scene and was fleeing, and the police officer came to the scene. He had no evidence to believe that there was anybody hurt or threatened inside the home that was burglarized. But the officer testified. He testified that if Garner jumped over a fence that he was approaching, he would never be able to catch Garner, because Garner was a young, I think he was 15 years old. The officer had a lot of equipment on, et cetera, et cetera. So he shot Garner in the back of the head and killed him. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States had in front of it statistics on how the fleeing felon rule that was then the law in Tennessee had a disproportionate impact on minority citizens, particularly black citizens. Now, I bring up Garner because what really prompted the change to not let police officers use deadly force in circumstances where there was no threat either to the officer or to fellow citizens was local decisions by local police departments to say, look, we're not going to do this anymore. Now, the Supreme Court got into the matter very late in the day, and they said, no, you can't do this, although there were some dissenting opinions. The Supreme Court came into the matter late in the day. It was the local police departments and local citizens who said, look, we can't have this anymore. And to go back to the point about racial profiling, forget about the Supreme Court. They're not going to say cops can't use pretextual traffic stops. Again, that was a 9-0 decision. If the change is going to happen, it has to start at the local level.
And I would just say we've seen that. We've seen a number of chiefs who have turned that corner, more progressive chiefs who are teaching their officers that we will not engage in pretextual stops. We saw what happened, to add on to your numbers, in New York City on stop and frisk, where they were stopping and frisking hundreds of thousands of people every year, and when they stopped, crime continued to go down precipitously. It is unbelievable to see what happened in New York City when they stopped what we call the hit rate. Okay, the hit rate is how few times you actually get contraband when you perform a stop. We saw this with another very close friend of mine, Joe Arpaio, with Latinos.
You got some interesting friends, man.
You wouldn't believe all the people who write me Christmas cards and everything else. It is pretty nice. So he was doing the same thing with the Latino population in Phoenix, where basically he had told his officers, go out and stop whoever you want. And then this is again something that Thurgood Marshall saw and pointed out, which was the whole idea that what police officers were doing, where they were just creating reasons to stop people. So if you were driving too fast, you were likely to have drugs. If you're driving too slow, you were likely to have drugs. If you had a baby car seat and no baby, you were likely to have drugs. If you had a baby, you were more likely to have drugs. If you had a bumper sticker that said, Jesus loves you, you were more likely to have drugs. If you had a bumper sticker that said, you know, Satan loves you, you probably had drugs. I mean, it became this complete silliness on who they would stop, and they claimed that all this training that they had gone through allowed them to do so. But we have seen a number of chiefs who have really moved toward the importance of community policing, realizing that actually you make your best cases when the community trusts you. When that neighbor says, you know what I saw, as opposed to that neighbor saying, you know what, I'm not telling you what I saw because more likely than not you're going to come up and lock me up or lock my kids up. This is what we're seeing in the immigrant community right now, where this kind of, if you go after the immigrant community, who's going to tell you that crimes are occurring in the immigrant community? That trust is so incredibly important to policing. There was a task force on 21st century policing that we created that brought together everyone from Brittany Packnett from the Black Lives Matter movement to Brian Stevenson from EJI to Chief Chuck Ramsey from Philadelphia, came together and came up with about 50 recommendations on ways we can improve police and community relations. You cannot find that currently on the DOJ COPS website.
You know, one thing too, going back to how forgiving we are to police officers who commit acts of violence in part because they had to think quickly and they were reacting to something. We expect a much more deliberative process, it seems, from people who are accused of crimes. You think about the death penalty is supposed to deter people from committing murder. We expect that they're going to do a cost-benefit analysis as they're there at the gas station, apparently. And why do we have one rule for one person with a gun and a very different rule for another?
I just wanted to add on that I think you were speaking earlier about the images of kind of civil rights protesters and police officers and you know, the sort of infamous kind of image of people like Sheriff Bull Connor and things along those lines. And I think one of the things that obviously there's been changes in how police operate today as opposed to, say, 55 years ago. I think one of the things that I think is probably worth noting is the question of the images themselves and the way in which they've kind of galvanized and helped to potentially shape and change public opinion is some of what we're seeing now today with the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that have taken place. Not simply around questions of police brutality, but police killings as well too. One of the things that I've found most interesting is in some of the discussions that those images have prompted is not just concerns regarding training, officer training, or even dealing with bias amongst police officers, but really some of the ways in which court decisions like Graham versus Connor, and the way in which over time the federal courts and Supreme Courts have really shifted to a perspective of assessing officer interactions with citizens from the perspective of police officers themselves, and how that's helped to kind of inculcate a sense that if a Darren Wilson can say, you know, here's Michael Brown who is coming at him like a demon and appears to be sort of being driven by some sort of superhuman strength, that perception of, or that reasonable understanding that an officer feared for his life or her life becomes the norm that justifies many of these police shootings that are taking place, really raises a question in terms of how the way in which we try to not just bring about some kind of justice, but really deal with the kind of basic kind of lack of accountability in some ways, or almost kind of impunity that officer-involved shootings kind of bring to the fore, if that is not just a question of like how officers are trained, but also how the law deals with the way in which police operate and shields them from some degree of accountability in much of the same way that we see behind bars within prisons themselves. There's very little accountability for the ways in which prisoners can be mistreated by correctional officers. They can be placed in solitary confinement for long periods of time. That in many ways, in both kind of arenas of how state officials operate, whether it's on the streets in terms of police officers or behind bars in prisons, that the law has been interpreted in such a way where we built in a sense of impunity in terms of how officials can operate under the color of the law.
Is it possible to have these conversations without appearing anti-police?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not anti-police in any way, shape, or form. I was a longtime prosecutor. I relied on police. I recognize the importance of having police for my personal safety, but I was working with police chiefs. I was working with police officers. When we went into New Orleans, and Steve Taylor is someone who's in the audience here today, who was part of our investigation of New Orleans Police Department. We sat down with police officers and asked them what they wanted. And what they said they wanted, number one was they wanted, and this is leading into the Danziger Bridge incident, post-Katrina, with the murder of about 6 or 7 family members, shooting of a bunch of others by police officers. They had stopped training the officers. The officers said, we want to be trained in how to deal with these situations. They had issues with, officers are human beings. They're dealing with the same stressors that all the rest of us are dealing with. The person who was evaluating the officers, who officers went to for that anonymous, you know what, I'm having financial issues, I'm having marital issues, was the same person who was determining their fitness for duty. So would pull them off the force. We said, that's crazy. So we set up systems there on recruitment, on promotion system. It was a promotion system where the officers were the ones who felt it was unfair. We worked very closely with the officers to make their lives better with the realization that that was going to make the public safety, that was going to enhance public safety. But we've seen chiefs all over the place. We've seen prosecutors increasingly now actually being part of the solution. The problem is that those who have the ear of the current administration are not trying to be part of the solution. They're trying to ensure that officers never get prosecuted for anything at all that they do. They're trying to ensure that everyone is under this belief that an officer can do no wrong. Officers are simply human beings, and we have to find ways to prevent human beings from killing other human beings unnecessarily.
And I would just like to add also, because certainly I don't want any of my remarks to be taken to think that officers in general are bigoted or biased. The problem is how they're trained and the institutional, often unconscious bias that drive these policies. That's the problem. I mean, in the 50s, perhaps, certainly in the 60s, there were bigoted police officers because most of the police departments were not integrated. That's not the case anymore. I was talking to the person who drove me in from the airport last night, and he was telling me how, I guess it wasn't that long ago, that they were looking for white police officers in the city of Memphis. The problem is not so much bias or bigoted officers, it's the training and the institutionalized procedures that caused some of the things that we saw with Mr. Castile that we saw in New York City and that we're seeing all over the country. That's the problem.
If I could just add real quick, I think one of the things that we also have to work to do is like find ways to kind of get past the rhetoric of criticism of the police being interpreted as anti-police. You know, I took a Lyft ride from the airport to the hotel, and if I had a bad experience with that driver, well, I'm a nice guy, I probably would have given him like 4 stars. I wouldn't give him 1 star. But some people are very adamant. They're like, you know, my Uber was a bad ride. They didn't like the way the music he played or he talked too much. 1 star. And I think if somebody were to do that, they're not considered anti-Uber or anti-Lyft. It's that they have criticisms, sometimes they're grounded, sometimes they're not well grounded, of that particular interaction that they had with that particular driver. And I think at a moment, especially if you watch some of Roy's friends on Fox News talk about, no, if you hear them talk about like millennial people of a younger generation get cast as snowflakes, right? That's the terminology. They can't handle criticism. They sort of, you know, if they get a little bit of heat, they wilt, you know, they melt under pressure. And I think one of the things that is profound about the rhetoric of criticism of police officers being considered anti-police is it's almost kind of like a snowflake-like mentality. It's like any kind of criticism, any kind of concern around or questioning of how police officers operate is considered anti-police. And one of the things that I think is most, you know, I'm not going to be a snowflake and be like, oh, being considered anti-police is going to hurt my feelings. But I think one of the bigger questions is that it reinforces a logic that only police officers, that police officers can only be accountable to other police officers, and that public criticism, citizen concern is not really, you know, citizens don't only have so much of a say in terms of how police operate, and because of the nature of the way in which policing operates, it's only police officers who are in the best position to criticize, to hold accountable other police officers.
And one of the reasons that it's crucial that we feel free to criticize law enforcement, and I say this as a former prosecutor, in fact the majority of us up here are former prosecutors. Make what you will of that, and all of your friends, right? But is that law enforcement has disproportionate political power, and their voice is always going to be heard in the legislature, amongst the executive branches of our many governments, and that matters. You know, in the federal system right now, it is a problem across administrations that the Department of Justice is the principal advisor to the president on criminal justice matters, that you've got a building that's primarily prosecutors that has the president's ear. There needs to be a greater diversity of voices, and we have to be brave enough to withstand the charge that we are being critical of the police to make that difference, because they do have that high podium that they stand on already.
I'd like to ask, we mentioned, I've heard a few phrases thrown out, community policing and accountability. What specific things can law enforcement do just on a day-to-day basis to improve those relations? You see the video of the guy that goes out into the community, he plays with all little black kids and things like that. He plays basketball. So what kind, are those, is that the way, or what is?
So I wouldn't recommend that everybody play basketball, because I've seen some people and they shouldn't play basketball. But it's actually not that hard. It is sitting down with the community and asking them what their concerns are. What do you want as a community? Where do you want us to be? What do you think should be enforced, knowing that we have limited resources to do so? It is training officers to understand implicit bias, just like everyone should be trained in what it means to have implicit bias. Black folks have implicit bias about other black folks. I mean, this is training that should be for everyone. Teaching de-escalation as an actual method of policing. How do I lower the volume, the tension in a situation? What do I actually do? How do you get more transparency in the entire criminal justice system. We have no idea who prosecutors are prosecuting and who they're not prosecuting. We have no idea the number of police departments that push back on the idea of actually keeping data based on race. We actually, our criminal justice statistics are horrendous. The fact that it takes us a year to find out how much crime happened the year before. I mean, that's where we are right now. All of these things are not that hard and would help, but the first thing is police officers have to be willing to sit down with the communities that they police and ask them what it is they're doing right and what it is they're doing wrong, and do so in a way where there's actually constructive movement forward. That'd be the first step.
And I would just add also, as Roy mentioned earlier, there are certain procedures that we read about and hear about on the local news and in the courts. Roy mentioned the stop and frisk. Stop and frisk originated, or at least got the Supreme Court's approval in 1968 in a case called Terry versus Ohio. That case was pure and simply a case about police officer safety. This was the Warren Court. A few days after Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated, this was the Warren Court saying, we're going to let police officers frisk an individual where that officer reasonably believes that the person he or she is dealing with is a danger. What's happened since then is that stop and frisk, you hear about President Trump saying, well, I'm in favor of stop and frisk. Well, stop and frisk was not designed to be a policy that was aimed at entire communities. What happened in New York City was that stop and frisk became a policy that targeted certain types of individual, and it upset the community. It's the same with shooting felons who flee a scene when there's no threat. It was, as Roy mentioned, it was the local communities and local police who said, look, we can't do this anymore because of the impact that it is having on certain parts of our community. Racial profiling. There's a way to eliminate the problems. Police officers have to stop engaging in pretextual traffic stops. Ordinary traffic stops, conventional traffic stops, you don't have the same racial disparities. What you have, the racial disparities prop up when you have these pretextual traffic stops. So there are things that can be done tomorrow that would ease a lot of these problems, or maybe even eliminate some of the problems.
And at the macro level, too, we need to make better decisions. And employ law enforcement, we have to ask ourselves, are we solving a problem? And too often we're not solving a problem. Think about narcotics, the kinds of cases where so much of mass incarceration and other problems come from. Do we solve that problem by sweeping up low-wage labor? Those of you who are economists, do you close down a business by sweeping up low-wage labor? Of course not. No wonder it didn't work. And it doesn't work now either. That's something that any business can replace, and they do. Yet we keep doing the same thing over and over and over, and the cost is phenomenal. Roy, I am a practicing lawyer. I'm just a pro bono lawyer. And you know, that means I go into prison, and I meet with people who I've represented for clemency mostly. And sometimes I go in and meet people I represented for clemency who didn't get it. Last year I went in to see a man named Robert Shipp, who I left that meeting crushed because he was going to remain in prison, and none of it solved any problem whatsoever. Imprisoning him for the length of time that we have denied no one of cocaine. And yet the cost to our society of doing that and repeating that same mistake is severe.
Just on, I guess, 2 points. One, I think one of the examples, and this isn't necessarily a policing question, that I've seen that has been most heartening to me is to kind of look at some of the developments that have been taking place in Philadelphia, in part because I'm from Philadelphia, but I think one of the election of Larry Krasner as a district attorney there has been an incredible opportunity to see how sort of nuts and bolts experiments around what role prosecutors can play in stepping away from mass incarceration, pushing back against mass incarceration, what those can look like. And one of the things that I would encourage everyone to do, especially those who are on the panel who are former prosecutors or what have you, is he recently released a memo, or a memo from his office has recently been published, 5-page memo that really dictates what are the new guidelines that prosecutors within his office are going to work off of. And the primary, the sort of guiding principle that really directs how those prosecutors are going to operate is, here are ways that we can take steps to end mass incarceration, that really can afford the city of Philadelphia to move away from the incredible human and financial burden that mass incarceration has really levied on that city. And those steps are as dramatic as starting plea agreements, the discussions on plea agreements from the high end of the sentencing spectrum to the low end, and say, what are the ways that we can not only think about doing plea agreements in a way that that include the lower end of the spectrum of potential sentencing charges, but also think about the financial cost that each potential plea agreement is going to have for whomever the defendant is. And that real shift in thinking about the role of prosecutors, particularly when 90%, some say 95% of those who are currently incarcerated today, those who get incarcerated on a day-to-day basis are people who haven't necessarily been sentenced before, a jury and what have you, but have been who have taken a plea agreement. And the ways in which that change in terms of how prosecutors interact with defense attorneys in sentencing can be, particularly important in terms of diverting more and more people away from incarceration. And then the second point is, I think, especially because we're here under the sort of 50th anniversary of King's assassination, to really think about how important this question of nonviolence was for King. I mean, I think it really says something about our society when we're talking about, we're sort of debating, we're sort of thinking about not only the profound amount of violence that our government is involved in executing around the world, right? But also the ways in which we sort of tacitly accept the levels of police violence that take place on our street and the impact that that has on our broader society. And I think thinking about how we can work in a more significant way kind of principles of nonviolence in terms of the way in which our criminal justice system operates would be something that would be more in step with the legacy of King than many of what is oftentimes talked about today.
I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions, so I'm going to ask one other question for our panelists, but if you have a question, can you make your way to one of the microphones so you can be ready? So kind of on that note, that what we do isn't always in accordance with Dr. King's legacy, what would you say, and I invite any of the panelists to speak to this, to someone who says that they are in favor, they support Dr. King's legacy and his mission, but they also support our current practices in the justice system?
You can't. You can't possibly support the idea of fairness and justice and look at our current system and find that it is fair and just in any way, shape, or form. I mean, Mark used to come and talk to me about clemency and about the importance of giving more people clemency. And Mark was 100% correct on the idea that we incarcerate too many people for too long with no basis for doing so. I mean, anyone who just turned around and who read the recent article about the woman who got 5 years for voter fraud. What the hell is the point of that? Okay, that is complete ignorance and hatefulness. But why do we take someone who is in possession of drugs and lock them up for 10 years? What does that do? Does it have any deterrent effect? Does it have any public safety effect? Or does it destroy that person's family, that person's chance for ever having a job, that person's chance for recovery? But that's what we do over and over again. In no other countries put murderers for less time than we put people who have drug possession charges. I mean, President Obama granted clemency to 1,700 people. Of those 1,700 people, one person so far that I'm aware of has been reincarcerated for, I think it was some kind of drug dealing. Those were 1,700 lives. 500 of them were life sentences that were commuted. Those are now productive members of our society. You cannot look at the current justice system and say that we are living up to what Martin Luther King asked us to live up to. You can't do it.
And I would say this too, and that is, you know, that person who asked that hasn't talked to any of us yet. But we're not doing a very good job. I'm not doing a very good job always of finding those people who think that the task is completed. And one of the things that Dr. King did was he talked in the context of faith so often. And that matters. And it is an opportunity too, for I know not everyone is Christian, not everyone who is here is Christian. I am. And that means it's an opportunity for me, that instead of talking to people who agree with me about these things, I need to go on Wednesday night to First Baptist Church in a smaller town and find those people that don't know these things. And I need to bring someone who's gotten clemency with me so that they can tell their story. And that's an important task that's ahead of us, I think.
Please ask your question.
So one person you didn't have up there was a police officer, a retired Pennsylvania State Trooper. One of the things I was trained in was Operation White Line, drug interdiction by the DEA. My life kind of changed after I had arrested a white guy, Italian, from Brooklyn on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, testified in federal court. I end up at the lead DEA's office downtown Pittsburgh, and he says to me, you know, we're looking for young black guys driving really nice cars. That made me wake up to what they had trained us to do, and I had to change, you know, talking about discretion, change how I operated, change how I did things. So there is implicit bias as well as explicit bias within policing. I think we all recognize that. We also need to think about how are we expending our resources. I was scheduled probably once a week to do Operation White Line, actually out there looking for drug dealers. Also work with canine officers, scheduled to do that. So those are I just wanted to give you some food for thought, something to think about.
Thank you so much. Any comments based on it? No? Okay. Thank you.
Hello, thank you to the panelists. I respectfully understand the point that you were making, Professor, about unconscious bias on the part of police, but perhaps it's my pessimism. I did not raise my hand when you asked your initial question. In terms of whether that is unconscious bias or out and out racism, you know, the comedian Paul Mooney used to tell a joke that when the police stop you and point that gun at you and say, nigger, get out the car, they're talking to you. So whether it's, you know, good old-fashioned hard Klan-toting racism or whether it's unconscious bias, we see these scenarios play out time and time again where that bias is reflected in the terrorism of our communities. And it seems like almost there's no end in sight, right? Because the police aren't policing themselves, the prosecutors aren't holding them accountable, the state courts are not rising these cases up, and you've talked about numerous cases where the Supreme Court is not strengthening the protections against the people. So when I ask myself what's left, the people are left and activism is left. And when the people rise up and say that these conditions are not tolerable and we're not going to live like this, and we reflect that not only in the streets, but at the voter polls, hopefully that is the only thing we have left because these systems are not protecting us. So I know we're going to talk about activism later in the symposium, but I wanted to ask you all what you think the role of very kind of outward-facing activism can have in influencing the justice system so that the norm shifts. The norm shifts away from this over-policing state that we're in to a truly more just system, because the system is not policing itself, and therefore the people must rise up and say that this is not tolerable, this is not okay, in the spirit of Dr. King.
Can I address the first point, since I assume that was addressed to me, your first part of the comments? The gentleman who came right before you is an example of what I was trying to say, in the sense that not all police officers are racist or bigoted. Are there a few? Of course there are. There are a few bigoted lawyers, and bigots exist throughout our society. I do not think it's fair, however, I don't think it's fair to paint a broad brush and say, well, all cops are biased, all cops are bigoted. And so that was the point that I was making. And as that gentleman also acknowledged, he was trained. He alluded to Operation Pipeline. That is the federal program that the DEA began, I believe, in the late 80s and in the 90s that trained officers how to target motorists on the highway. And again, part of that was the institutional racism and bias that that officer referred to. So that's, I just want to address that. The point about the activism, I'll let somebody else address.
Well,
listen, voting, you're going to have a great panel after this one. By all means, everyone should vote.
The impact of activism cannot be overstated. I mean, that's why we're here celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. King. Activism matters. When the little kids faced the fire hoses and adults faced the fire hoses and dogs, that mattered. Okay? What Sacramento, with the killing of Stephon Clark, they shut down a basketball arena. And all of a sudden they started talking about police reform. Okay? It matters. When Black Lives Matter turns itself into or starts promoting what they called Campaign Zero and put out 10 constructive ideas for how to move forward on improving policing, that matters. When Parkland students, for the first, I mean, do you think any legislation would have passed Congress or Florida had it not been for the protests of the Parkland students? Absolutely not. Now, are you going to win all these battles? Probably not. But 100%, you're not going to move this current federal government, but you will move your state and local government. And if you vote in those smaller elections, you're going to move your school board, you're going to move your prosecutor's offices, you're going to move your judges. So, heck yeah, protests. That is really probably the best means right now to make change.
And if you go back to Dr. King on this, one of the remarkable things, and this is in that last speech that he gave here in Memphis, is how much stronger influence can be than power, and how principle is going to win out in the end. He talks there about himself and Bull Connor, and how Bull Connor had the police dogs and had the fire hoses, and they were imprisoned and sang. But who won out in that battle? And he ends that by saying, and we turned Bull into a steer. And so it does matter.
I would just say, we can have a long conversation about activism and why it matters, but I think, just to kind of reference King, there's a section on Where Do We Go From Here that I've always found, that I've recently discovered and found very profound, where he's very critical about the failures of the civil rights movement. And he's critical not only about it in the shadow of the Watts Rebellion in 1965 and the sort of emergence of black power and the way in which many of the sort of basic kind of ideas of the civil rights movement were being criticized, but also being critical of the movement kind of internally. And he speaks in very, almost kind of dark terms about the way in which the civil rights movement was oftentimes so committed to kind of building mobilizations at the local level, but had been very ineffective at actually building effective organizations that could permeate society in a way that could really last beyond the sort of period of a particular kind of Albany movement or Birmingham movement or what have you. And I think activism is important, voting is important, but what is really important as well is questions of organization and questions of actually being able to build the kind of, on the ground, both grassroots organizations, but broader movements, alliances that really give us an opportunity not only to raise real public outcry around something like this Stephon Clark shooting, but deal with the sort of issues that kind of instance reflects the way in which they operate on a day-to-day basis, so that at the end of the day, we can also do something about one of the sort of fundamental issues that King also spoke about, which was just the real question of poverty in this country, which if we look at, and sometimes I feel bad about the sort of levying all the criticism at the criminal justice system, because in many ways the criminal justice system has become the way of managing the real profound levels of inequality that exist in this country. The way in which our country has the highest level of wealth inequality than any other developed country in the world, and how we don't really have organizations that can deal with the way in which that poverty manifests on a day-to-day level beyond being able to kind of get out in the streets and protest and what have you.
Please.
Alita Poplar, I'm community coordinator for community action and ecumenical outreach for the Memphis and Shelby County unit of Church Women United. I'm also a military veteran, a minister, and a victim of police racial profiling. I wrote my question down, and it's regarding the discretion and the exercise of discretion historically and even today. Many of the people who are in law enforcement, education, and other systems profess to be Christians and attend church service on any given Sunday. With that noted, we must note that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not forget to remember that first he was a minister, a Christian minister. In addition to love, Christians are taught to seek justice. Can you talk about the importance of white congregations in particular to address the issues of discretion and unconscious racism?
That's all you, Mark.
Yeah. I'll take that one. But I completely agree with what you've said, that the biggest impediments to achieving what we need to achieve in terms of racial equity in criminal law are people who identify as Christian, and principally in white congregations. And that means we need to find a way to talk to them. I mentioned before that there is an opportunity. Now, I did a project on the death penalty where we went to the most conservative congregations we could find. We went to Regent University and twice in Texas and Oklahoma City. And we did the sentencing phase of the trial of Jesus in 11 states. To put into juxtaposition this faith that has as its center a wrongful conviction and execution, and what they were doing in that state. And those of us that believe that there are problems in this country who have the ability to do so need to make those connections and make those arguments, drawing that circle of Christianity around all of us that are in that church in that day, because we have some shared principles. And if we don't have shared principles, we've got shared narratives. We've got the same stories. Dr. King in that last speech talked about the Good Samaritan. And that is a story about how we should treat victims of crime. Nothing less. And that's a good message to take out there.
I'm sorry, though, but let's not take the black church out of the equation. The black church sat there and watched the over-incarceration happen, and in many ways supported the over-incarceration because they separated the good blacks from the bad blacks. So we just have to be very careful about blaming anybody, because we are all to blame in the mess that is our current justice system.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. So one of the things that I noticed that was missing from this conversation is talking about public defenders. When we're talking about the criminal justice system, we haven't mentioned the people who are every day trying to overcome all of these issues you're all pointing out. So I'm wondering if you all have thoughts on, whether it's talking about funding public defender offices or training them or making sure that they have the resources that are necessary, if anyone on the panel had any thoughts about that.
Well, I'm all in favor of it, and you're right. No, you're right, because not only do public defenders, are they a big part of the system, they are overtaxed. They have caseloads of hundreds of cases, and you cannot demand justice in a courtroom setting if your lawyer is too stressed out or has too many cases, or more importantly, doesn't have the time and the resources to devote to your case. So you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I'll leave with this final thought. I want to thank our panelists. Oh, do you have another? Comment? Sir?
I think, do we have time for one more question?
Huh? Oh, okay, one more question. Wait. Listen to the dean.
Yes, my name is Dr. Karen Chancellor, and I'm recently retired as the Chief Medical Examiner for Shelby County. And I don't know if this is a panel question or a comment for the whole group, but part of my question was partially answered by the first gentleman who commented as a former law enforcement agent. But I wonder if any local persons responsible for training of police officers or prosecutors are present at this conference.
There's a gentleman by the name of Steve Taylor who I believe is here who is working on consent decrees. He was a former Memphis police officer while he was at law school, I believe. But he is working right now on training law enforcement officers.
Great, thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you.
Good point about this.
I'd also like to thank the wonderful questions that we had from the audience. We appreciate your engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take a very short break and reconvene with our voting rights panel at 10:30. Thank you.